Hello and welcome to Enter the Boardroom with Newroll. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Newroll, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today's guest, Dan Gardner, is the New York Times best-selling author of Superforecasting, How Big Things Get Done, Risk, and Future Babble. His books have been published in 26 countries and 20 languages. Before becoming an author, Dan was an investigative journalist, recognised with every major award in Canadian journalism. He is an honorary fellow with the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public Policy and International Affairs. Dan, Superforecasting has long been one of my favourite books, which I recommend as a must-read for all board members. Several guests on Enter the Boardroom have also recommended How Big Things Get, and having read it in preparation for this conversation, it now certainly sits alongside Superforecasting on my board member must-read list. I'm so excited for this episode. A huge welcome and thank you for joining us.
And thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Can we start just talking about those insights from Superforecasting? And perhaps you could just summarise for those listening who haven't read it, what the key insights for board members are.
Yeah. So Superforecasting basically summarizes the research of my co-author, Phil Tetlock, who's a very eminent psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania in the Wharton School. And he has spent his career studying forecasting and experts making forecasts and so on. And at one point in his career, he did this landmark research which showed that the average expert was about as accurate as a dart-throwing chimpanzee, and that became a globally famous punchline. But Phil's a bit more constructive than that. He doesn't want to engender cynicism. And so he worked with the U.S. intelligence community because, as you can imagine, the intelligence community makes a lot of forecasts, and they're rather important. And he worked with them to try and determine how good can we be at forecasts, and once we know what the possibilities are, how can we go about ensuring that we are as good as we can be. And a long story short, they engaged in a huge research program that involved an enormous number of volunteers who are making forecasts about real-world geopolitical events, and that's a critical piece. These are not laboratory experiments. These are real-world problems, the sort of tough problems that the intelligence community has to tackle. And what his research program showed is that, generally speaking, people are bad at making forecasts, not a surprise, but there was a very small percentage of these volunteer forecasters who were, generally speaking, ordinary folks, who were absolutely outstanding, and they were consistently outstanding. And consistent, of course, matters because anybody can be lucky once, twice, or three times, but if you are consistently accurate, then we're probably looking more at skill than we're looking at luck. And so because these people were top of the charts, they ended up being called super forecasters, rather grandiosely, but that was the name. And so then the question is, well, what makes them so good? And what's interesting is that if you go down the list of things that you might think would explain that, well, they're geniuses, they have extreme education, they have specialist knowledge. None of these explanations fly when you examine them closely. They are smart people. They are numerate people. They're well informed about international affairs. They wouldn't be volunteering to make geopolitical forecasts in their spare time if they weren't. But none of those explanations satisfies it. Basically, what it is a cluster of habits of mind and ways of thinking that really explained why these people are so good. To summarize them, it's things like intellectual curiosity. These are people who just like learning. They like learning lots. These are people who are actively open-minded. That's a term from psychology. It means basically that these are people who like going out and finding other perspectives, right? So if I have my own view on who's going to win the presidential election, and I have my own thinking for why I conclude that, but you think I'm wrong, well, that intrigues me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your perspective. And most importantly, and this is the active part of active open-mindedness, I want to hear your reasoning and your evidence, and I'm going to think about them critically. So they're the sorts of people who are constantly thinking hard, trying to find new perspectives, and then drawing out of them what is valuable in those perspectives, what is valid and then synthesizing that into their own thinking. So these people are constantly seeking out other perspectives and synthesizing these other perspectives into their own thinking. That's sort of at the high level. These are habits of mind, tendencies, and so on. At a more specific level, what do they do? Number one, they think in terms of probabilities, probabilistic thinking. These are not people who talk in terms of certainties. It will happen, it won't happen. They don't think in those terms. They get very comfortable thinking in probabilistic terms. The other big thing that they do is that they like to take, big intractable problems. If you think about a big problem like, will Russia invade Ukraine? That is a big, big, big problem. It's very hard to get your arms around because there are so many different components. Well, what they do is they tend to break these problems down into those components so that the smaller component is something you can grapple with, you can analyze. And then they take the components that they've grappled with and analyzed, and then they reassemble them back into a bigger picture. This idea of breaking down big complex problems into smaller, simpler components, we call, in terms of forecast, you can call it Fermi estimation, Fermi forecasts. Fermi, of course, is the name of the great Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi, and Enrico Fermi became famous for his estimates. But the core of how Fermi made his estimates was simply that process of taking big, complex problems, breaking down into components, and understanding the components. And it's a wonderful habit of mind, which I like to call it the Swiss Army knife of decision-making, because if you become good at that sort of decomposition and recomposition, you can use that for all sorts of decisions, not only forecasts, but all sorts of other decisions. So yeah, in sum, there is no silver bullet. There is no single factor which I can point to and say, this is what makes a forecaster super. But it is this constellation of factors. The one thing I try to emphasize when I lecture about the research here is this: the individual bits and pieces, do this, do that, think in probabilistic terms, etc. They're all terribly important, but there's really a fundamental underlying structure that matters most. And if you get that right, other things, these other components, will flow from it. What I mean by that is this. Think about the concept of intellectual humility, or you might also call it epistemic humility. It's almost like a worldview. It's a sense that, look at this universe, look at this reality, look at this world that we're trying to understand and then anticipate. It's incredibly complex. It's massively, spectacularly complex. And who are we? I mean, come on. We're naked apes. We're a jumped up species of primate, okay? Our brains evolved in an environment radically unlike the environment in which we now live. And so there's going to be, this mismatch between the human brain, which, by the way, I don't want to be insulting. It's a magnificent thing, but still, it was not evolved to do the things that we are now doing with it. And the things that we are now doing are so incredibly difficult and complex. If you think about that, what does that mean? Well, it means we're going to make mistakes. To understand things even a little bit, to see even a little bit into the future, takes an enormous amount of struggle. And even then we're going to make mistakes and so on. And of course, one of the axioms of the intellectually humble is there is no certainty, right? So here's what I mean by things flowing logically from that foundation. If you adopt that worldview, and by the way, I can go down a list of thinkers who have demonstrably excellent judgment and who are definitely intellectually humble in the sense that I'm talking about. If you adopt that worldview, well, what have I just said? Well, it's axiomatic that nothing is certain. Well, if nothing is certain, well, that means that you have to drop 0% and 100% from your thinking. That means that you no longer say the words certain or impossible, right? Unless something violates a law of physics, it is not impossible. Is it possible that Donald Trump, New York real estate developer, could become president of the United States? It's not impossible, right? If you are an intellectually humble person, it becomes axiomatic that you don't talk about it will happen or it won't happen. And so what are you left with? You're left with probabilities. You're left with thinking in terms of 1 to 99%. So this is what I mean by the foundational worldview, which super forecasters have, which all the demonstrably excellent people with excellent judgment have, I think, in my experience and in my research, they all have this. It leads to certain habits of mind. Now, you can learn about the habits of mind. You can buy my book and read about them and look at the specifics. But I think that they all flow sort of logically from that underlying worldview. And the worldview is what's really critically important.
Can you just, for those who aren't familiar with this concept of probabilistic thinking, expand on that a bit? Because for me, the way you talked about establishing base rates and adjusting the base rate probability was very powerful.
So, probabilistic thinking, it's very easy to fancy it up, but it really is a simple way of looking at reality and saying, you know what, we can't really be sure of anything, right? That's our axiom. So what do we do? Well, now everything becomes a question of a degree of certainty or a degree of uncertainty, depending on which perspective you take. And so you mentioned the base rates. This is a great example. So super forecasters, they all do this. If you look at a problem, let's say Russian forces are building up on the border of Ukraine. Will Russia invade Ukraine? Well, the one way of tackling a problem like that, it comes very psychologically easy to us, is what Daniel Kahneman, the great psychologist, called the inside view. And the inside view means look at the specific problem. Look at all the details of the specific problems. Look at what Putin is saying. Look at what the Ukrainians are saying. Look at the specific forces, all the details of the particular problem in front of you. But there's a completely different way of thinking about it, which is the outside view, or what statisticians call the base rate, which is basically when you get a whole bunch of one country parking a large number of tanks on its border next to another country, how often do the tanks actually cross the border? Right? So then you go back into history and you do your research and you gather those numbers. That's what the statisticians would call the base rate of invasions given this scenario. And so what the super forecasters would do is that they would start with the base rate. And the reason why you always want to start with the base rate is because we are not psychologically inclined to do that. In fact, base rate neglect is absolutely routine. Absolutely bog standard. That's how human beings roll. We look at the specifics, not the general. So they start with the general. And so let's say you gather a whole bunch of instances that are relevant and you calculate the numbers and it comes out at 73%. Say the tanks are going to roll. That's where you start. Your forecast is now 73%. Now, let's talk about the specifics. Let's talk about what Putin is saying. Let's talk about the Ukrainians. Let's talk about the particular units that are on the border or whatever. And then adjust that 73% up or down accordingly. And that is the standard approach which super forecasters would take. And again, it's not fancy. It's not complicated. But it's just not natural. It's not what human beings naturally do. But it's incredibly effective.
How do you think board members listening to this can make most use of these insights you just shared?
Well, the fundamental step is to start with this idea of epistemic humility, right? If you can take that on board and think about it hard, these other things, which you can learn about in practice, and you should, these other things will flow logically from them. So, for example, one of my favorite illustrations is George Soros. Now, I'm not interested in George Soros as a political figure, as he is today. But if you remember George Soros in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, he becomes very famous because he's a very, very, very successful investor. And at that point, people started asking George, why are you so good? And of course, when you're that successful, you're perfectly entitled to say it's because I'm so smart. And George Soros said exactly the opposite. He said, and he still says to this day, that he owes his successful judgment to the fact that he is hyper aware that he is bound to make mistakes. Well, if you're hyper aware that you're bound to make mistakes, which is the ultimate expression of epistemic humility, what are you going to do? You're going to turn your consciousness inward on yourself, and you're constantly going to be saying, okay, I have a conclusion, I have some thinking, now where's the mistake? Because I know there's going to be mistakes in there. And so you become hyper self-critical. And therefore, you catch and correct more mistakes. And if you catch and correct the mistakes, your judgment gets better. And if you catch and correct more mistakes than the other guy, you beat the other guy. It's really that simple.
So where do you think, and in your experience, board members are most likely to go wrong with this? You've talked about the sort of failure to recognize the outside view. You've talked about the importance of epistemic humility. Are there other sort of classic gotchas that you most see people tripping up on?
Well, if we're talking about board members of, significant boards, chances are you're talking about significant people. You're talking about people who already have a track record of success. And if you're talking about people at the very top boards, you're talking about truly outstanding people. Well, guess what? Those people are in danger. They're in danger for a specific reason. Because you look back and you say, I am me. Look at my successes. And now I'm looking at this problem and I'm thinking, I know what the answer is. Well, that answer must be right because I am me, right? So the success itself engenders hubris, and then the hubris undermines the quality of the judgment. So success can actually undermine the very determinants of the success in the first place. And so that's why you have things like, it's sometimes called CEO disease. And we won't name names, but we all know that powerful people, when they get in positions of power because they have been successful, because they've demonstrated good judgment, that can be very corrosive of their judgment. And that, to me, is the really, again, I keep going back to the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks had it all figured out. Hubris, that's the great danger. And so when you're talking about successful people, the great danger is don't forget what got you here. And what got you here is not hubris. It's just the opposite. It was intellectual humility, hard work, constantly examining yourself, thinking hard. And it's so easy to let that go, right? As I say, this is a theme from the ancient Greeks onward in our literature that power corrupts thinking. And the only way to stop that from happening is with determined effort.
I love that. And that reminds me, I can think of lots of people who spring to mind on that one. The other sort of paradigm there that actually comes to mind is I've seen people who've been lucky and have failed to recognize that it was luck that drove their success and are guilty of what I guess Annie Jute would call resulting. Is that a common occurrence? Do you have any sort of data on how much is what the mix of people who are guilty of failing to recognize their luck versus becoming hubristic?
Do I have data? No. But I can tell you from the observations of the great Danny Kahneman himself and from my own reading of history that is ubiquitous in human affairs. The old saying about, defeat is an orphan, but
success has 1,000 parents.
Has 1,000 fathers, that's what we do, right? If I make a call and it succeeds, I congratulate myself. The people around me congratulate me. I am rewarded. And we see this, what the clearest illustration is stock markets. Every time there is a giant crash or a boom market, there's always some few number of people who are anointed as the sage people who saw it coming. Well, if you think about that for a moment, at any one time, there are literally millions of people all over the world who are making every possible call for stock markets, which means that at any one time, somebody's going to be right. And why are they going to be right? Because if you throw 1,000,000 darts, some of them are going to hit the bullseye. That is simply not a good way of judging judgment, the quality of their judgment. And there are countless examples of this. I have many of them in my second book, Future Babble. There are countless examples where somebody made a call, oh, the stock market's going to crash. Then the stock market crashes. This person is anointed as the great wise guru. People practically throw money at that person. And it turns out that person has really terrible judgment, and 10 years later, you've forgotten that person's name. And, oh, by the way, that person left with all that money that you just threw at them. And we do this over and over and over again because we mistake luck for skill. And that's why at the top, when I talked about the superforecasting research, I emphasized that point, because the research was carefully designed to ensure that you could actually distinguish between luck and skill. And this is an essential point to keep in mind about forecasts and forecasting. How do you get better at any skill, right? You practice it. You do it, right? Basketball, penalty kicks in soccer, whatever. You just do it. But what's the key to that practice and learning from the practice? It's the feedback. You get clear, immediate feedback. If I kick the soccer ball, it either goes in the net or it doesn't, and I see this instantly, and then I can learn from my experience. Obvious enough. Well, guess what? Most people are making forecasts in an environment where they do not get clear, unambiguous feedback at any time. Instead, what you get is extremely ambiguous feedback, or you get no feedback whatsoever, which is even more dangerous. And there's heaps of research that shows that in that environment, guess what? This will not surprise you, that people will interpret that feedback, poor feedback, in self-serving ways, and that will distort their perception, and that will actually make their judgment worse over time.
Ray Dalio has his team walking around with these clipboards, supposedly, where each decision they make gets recorded and then they get scored on it. And so when someone's then chipping in with an idea, I think they look at the score before they weight how much impact or how much notice they should take of it. Is that something you think board members should be walking around with, little sort of scoreboards around their neck, so that each time they weigh in, they're held to account for it?
That sounds like a little bit of an extreme model to me, but something like that absolutely should be used. What Phil and I advocate is for the creation of, you could call them shooting ranges, driving ranges, whatever metaphor you like, but it's in an environment in which people can practice and get good, clear, solid feedback. Practice with real-world forecasting questions. Unfortunately, most people don't have access to that at all. And as a result, then you are in the awkward position where you're saying, well, who should we put on our board? We want somebody who has, excellent judgment. What does excellent judgment mean in our context? It means the ability to make these necessary forecasts. How do we know that this person has excellent judgment? You're guessing. Right? And when you guess what you're going to do? You're going to go for the salient example. You're going to go for that one time this person made the right call. And that was so impressive. And it has stuck in my memory. And because of how psychology works, that really dominates my judgment about this person's skill. Does that make sense? No, it doesn't. Right? The crazy thing is, we are actually far more sophisticated when it comes to sports than we are to forecasts in the real world that actually matter. What manager of any professional sport would go and spend tens of millions of dollars hiring an athlete on the basis of, hey, do you remember that time he made that brilliant play? That was something, wasn't it? No manager on the planet would do that. And yet, in business, that happens pretty frequently. That's a huge mistake, and that's crazy, right? That's just indefensible. It drives me absolutely up the wall. And by the way, it's the same thing with the public. We listen to pundits, a columnist with the New York Times who says the following is going to happen. Okay, what's that columnist's track record? Nobody asked for the track record, and yet the crazy thing is, you then turn around and you turn on a baseball game. And you go, where are the statistics? Tell me his, home runs batted in, and all those other numbers that sports fans love so much. It's crazy. It's a very, very strange way to operate. And if I were in charge of an organization, I would say, no, we got to get more serious about this.
I'm trying to think what that might look like for assessing a board member. It's almost like you need a set of case studies, and you run them through those case studies and get them to make forecasts where you already know the outcomes, and then discuss the outcomes and perhaps do that as a group on a regular basis. Is that the sort of thing?
I think that's perfectly reasonable. In fact, what you've just described is something that I actually advocated for a certain, I'm wondering how I can describe, a certain special forces unit in the United States military. It was exactly that. Basically, you've already done this thing. It happened in the real world. You know what the actual outcome was. Well, okay, set up a simulation, then run people through it. And if you do this consistently and you do it in sufficient numbers that you actually have valid data, you can then actually, this person's ability to make good judgments in that environment. Of course, the key thing is to assure that you are asking the questions that are most relevant to the job itself. I don't want to be reductive. I mean, a board member is doing a lot more than simply making forecasts.
Sure. I want to build on the insights that you talked there around the importance of base rates from Superforecasting, because that came out again in How Big Things Get Done. And there were two huge insights that dropped for me personally reading it that seem of critical importance to board members. The first was how people regularly underestimate the costs of projects. And the second was how people materially underappreciate the fat tail risk when things do go wrong. That when things go wrong, they will often go catty wrong. I'm curious to hear from you. Why do you think smart people have not yet learned these lessons?
Because they're people is the short answer. You know, on why do people regularly underestimate costs and duration for projects? Douglas Hofstadter had a law, wonderful tongue-in-cheek law. It always takes longer than you think, even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. That's Hofstadter's law. And it's a brilliant, pithy way of expressing a really powerful insight, which is this. It's not just about the fact that we're underestimating. It's that we're underestimating when we know we're going to underestimate. And there's heaps of research that supports this. I could show you all that research, and after you say it and you say, oh, wow, I'm really underestimating things. The next time, boy, I better be more cautious, and you're gonna double the length of time and you double the estimated cost. So now you're covered, right? Well, guess what? You just underestimated it again. And the reason why I love Hofstadter's law and the insight from it is simply this. It's people tend to treat psychology and the work of people like Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow, which we've all read, they tend to treat it as a vaccine, right? I've read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, therefore I'm immune from psychological biases. No, you're not. And in fact, if you're thinking that way, you didn't read his book carefully because Kahneman was emphatic on this point. And yet, I can tell you from experience, I encounter people all the time who are sort of dismissive of, no, I've got that covered. I've taken care of that psychology stuff. I've taken care of that because I've read Kahneman's book. I'm done, right? No, that's treating it as a vaccine. And the point is, you can't treat it as a vaccine. Even if you're perfectly aware of the trap, you're probably still going to step into the trap. So now, what do you do about that? And the answer is, you take steps that ensure that the trap gets marked, and you step around it despite your intuitive judgment. And this is a perfect example, the base rates, right? So what do? You look at the base rates and you say, okay, I can't forecast forward how long this project is going to take or how much it's going to cost. I'm really bad at that. And my intuition is just going to screw me up. So what will I do? I'm going to look backwards into history, and I'm going to look at other people's projects that are like this. And I'm going to say, don't tell me about estimates. Tell me how long did it actually take? And I'm going to collect a whole bunch of those numbers, put them together, and that's my estimate. Bent, my co-author on How Big Things Get Done, Bent Flivbjerg at Oxford, he calls that reference class forecasting because the base rate is the reference class. So you're using real world data, and it encodes huge numbers of things. It encodes all that complexity that you can't possibly grapple with because these are real world outcomes. And you use that as your forecast, and by doing that, you basically just step neatly around the trap of planner's fallacy and excessive optimism. The other point that you make is so important. Bent's research is so important. And a lot of people, when they read how big things get done, they don't zero in, I think, as much as you did, rightly, on this insight, fat tails, because this is fundamentally important. Look at how people deal with the risk of overrun. People know that there's a risk of overrun. They know that they have to cover for the risk of overrun. So what do? They say, well, let's build a buffer into the budget. How much should the buffer be? Let's be 10%. No, let's be really conservative. Let's make it 15%. Or if they're extremely risk averse, they might say, let's make it 20%, right? And people do that all the time. What is the implicit assumption behind that decision? The implicit assumption is that the risk of overrun, the risk is normally distributed. The risk is on a bell curve. And so what's the single most important feature of a bell curve? The extremes aren't all that extreme, and there just aren't that many extreme outcomes, right? Which is why 15% buffer, that's pretty reasonable with a bell curve. But what Bent has shown is that in 24 different project categories, a huge array of project categories, using data from all over the world, is that only a small minority of project categories are actually normally distributed. All the rest are fat-tailed, which means that your risk analysis and your coverage, your buffer, are completely wrong and completely inadequate. And in fact, Bent has shown that among the more extreme fat-tailed project categories, that there is no upper limit on how bad things can go. Literally, no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse. So you get 300% overruns. You get 500% overruns, 800% overruns, which sounds like science fiction, but it happens. The Sydney Opera House went 1,400% over budget. Just try to wrap your mind around 1,400% over budget, right? So if you are dealing with these risks, making the assumption that they are normally distributed, that they are on a bell curve, you are putting yourself in extreme danger. And so this is a really fundamental insight from Bent's research, and I really hope it starts to be taken up and taken seriously.
Well, you included in the appendix an amazing table with the base rates for the cost risks of all those different projects, which I think was worth reading the book alone for, though there was so much more than that. And a lot of the projects listed there are ones probably most board members won't be exposed to. So, the nuclear power, Olympic Games, aerospace, there will be some, but obviously quite sector specific. But there were two project archetypes that stood out for me as situations where most board members will at some time face them, and I'd love to dig into those and just as to ask you how that we use them. And the two were IT projects, where I think you showed there was a 73% mean cost overrun, where 18% of the projects were in the tail with a more than 50% overrun, and 447% mean overrun was what happened in that tail. And then buildings projects, where there was a 62% mean cost overrun, 39% of projects were in the tail with more than a 50% overrun, and the mean overrun in that projects in the tail was 206%. Now, I have faced both of those problems as a board member in the past, and I wish I had had this insight at the time, because number one, I remember asking, how sure are we that we're going to overrun on this? And there was a very confident executive team who said, don't worry, we've got this. And I wish I'd had that data there. But number two, we were in a situation where the fat tail risk could have blown us up as an organization. And again, to have had that discussion in the boardroom would have been so helpful. But I'd love to hear how would you, as a board member, reviewing an IT project or a board proposal, challenge and support using those insights?
Right. It's great that you mentioned information technology. You're absolutely right. Because the information technology is so ubiquitous and IT projects are so ubiquitous, we tend to treat them as, well, this isn't terribly dangerous. This isn't terrible. No, in fact, they are more dangerous than most project categories. In fact, everyone knows that nuclear power is notoriously terrible for these risks. IT ranks just a hair above nuclear power. That's how dangerous it is. It's absolutely terrifying. How do you deal with this? You've got to stop thinking of it in terms of, we'll make a forecast and then we'll manage to the forecast. Because when you're in that environment of fat tails, making a forecast and managing to the forecast is really a bad idea. What you then have to do is you have to switch your thought process to black swan management, what we call black swan management, which is basically, if it goes wrong, it could go horribly wrong. So now, how do we identify? We have to get down in the weeds of the project. We have to identify those ways in which the project could go horribly wrong. And so we mentioned, for example, high-speed rail. If you're building high-speed rail in Britain, for example, what's the big problem you're going to face? Well, you're digging in the ground. What happens when you dig in the ground in Britain? You find old stuff. Archaeological digs, which is wonderful, by the way. I'm a history nut, and I absolutely love the fact that Britain is littered with this stuff. However, if you're building stuff, that's also a difficulty. So, because you then have to stop the project, and then you have to bring in an archaeologist, and you have to do proper assessment and clear it out of the way, and then you can proceed. Okay. So what do? You put an archaeologist on call. And this is standard operating procedure for big construction companies. What happens if this happens multiple times? What happens, how many archaeologists are there in Britain that you can actually just pick up a phone and get in like large numbers of them? And the answer is no. These things can then, if you get one instance of this and another, these individual instances can collide with each other like cars on a foggy highway. And that's when what is a fairly routine, manageable problem turns into a black swan. That's really disastrous. So having identified and having seen this in past projects, Bent actually did some consultation on this. Basically, it was, okay, you have to be prepared for that eventuality. How do you do that? Well, you have to get a whole bunch of archaeologists on retainer. So you can literally just speed dial them in, because you know from past history that that's one of the ways in which these projects can go badly off the rails, pardon the pun. And so that means, so that's an example of how you deal with, these problems. You have to use the history. You have to learn from past projects. One of the big failings of project management, there is an insufficient learning from past projects. And then you have to get imaginative, right? Because reality is so fantastically complex. It will find new ways to wallop you in the face. So how do you deal with that? You now need to get imaginative and think of those new ways to the extent that you can before they actually happen. That means you need to create a red team. And tell me, red team, tell me all the horrible ways that this thing can go wrong, right? You need to engage in a pre-mortem, the wonderful term invented by Gary Klein, which is basically you sit down with your management team and you say from the outset, okay, let's assume that it went horribly wrong. How did it go horribly wrong? Let's chart all the pathways to disaster. You need to get imaginative. You need to identify these things. And then once you've identified them, then you can serve to mitigate them. But you see, what I'm describing is a completely different management style than is a normal project where it's basically you make the forecast and you manage to the forecast. It's a radically different way of approaching the issue.
One of the forecasts boards often have to navigate is budgets, setting budgets for the year. And I imagine there must be, or it'd be possible to calculate what the base rate accuracy of a budget is for an organization of a given size. Is that something you've looked at ever?
Yeah, no. The short answer is no. And yes, absolutely, you're right. So this speaks to one of the meta points. The data, real world data around projects or around, for example, setting of budgets is incredibly valuable. Why? Because it's in the real world. Because all those complex ways in which things can go wrong, it's all built into the data because these are real outcomes. So we should be treating that data as an incredibly precious resource that you can use in so many different ways. We should be out hoovering up that data to the greatest extent possible. And yet in organization after organization after organization, they do not do that. I can tell you that there are governments that have entire departments of, defense that have not learned this lesson, right? They are not going around the world and hoovering up data on how long does it take exactly to, design and build and deliver ships. Well, let's find out all the people who have tried to design and deliver ships, and then collect all that data. That should be step one. You should have done that years ago. You haven't. And so this is a classic example. So we make budget forecasts every year. How good are the budget forecasts? Because if you knew that, if you had years and years and years of data, and you knew that with considerable accuracy, well, what could you do? Well, that's your base rate. And then you can look at that, and then you can judge this year's forecast in light of that data. And that really changes things. And it seems like common sense. It seems like it should be standard operating procedure. It's not. In fact, I have to say, in all the years of research that I've been doing this, the single most astonishing moment to me was when I remember having a conversation with Phil Tetlock, my co-author on Superforecasting, who was working with the U.S. intelligence community. And we were talking about judging forecasts. And he said to me that the U.S. intelligence community, after more than half a century of experience of making these forecasts, which are the basis for some of the most important decisions in the world, didn't know how accurate they were. And I asked him to repeat that. I said, they've never tested their forecasts for accuracy? No, there are lots of people who have lots of opinions about their accuracy, but they've never actually tested them for accuracy. And again, it was one of those conversations where it took about 5 minutes for it to sink in. That is just incredible. Now, that has begun to change, and thanks in large part to Phil Tetlock. But that is typical. Large, sophisticated organizations overlook low-hanging fruit all the time.
That's all we have time for with Dan for now, but we'll be releasing the second part of our conversation next week, where he discusses how boards get big things done on time and within budget, the key biases board members need to watch out for when making decisions, and the relationship between brain and gut in good judgment. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune back in for part 2 next week. If you found this conversation interesting and would like to be involved in similar discussions, join the New Role Board community. Community membership gives you access to 24-hour discussion threads on boardroom challenges and opportunities like those we've been discussing, smart online networking events, one-to-one career sessions with our headhunters, third-party board roles, mastermind groups, and Q&As with senior board members. Head to community.newrole.com to find out more.